we learned last time that when it says recording in progress, that's not actually recording, which means we have a 1.5 second interval before it actually starts recording.
Yeah, that important 1.5 seconds of privacy before it.
Privacy alert. All right. Well, if you're okay with it, I'd like to interview you as a scientist.
Okay.
So for those who are new, this is my brother Jonathan. He has a PhD in neuroscience, and he was recently published in, was it Nature?
Nature.
Yeah. So we'll get the whole scoop here.
So just a quick clarification: it's actually a PhD in psychology, but it's the subdiscipline is systems neuroscience.
Okay.
So, but neuroscience is like all over the place. So.
Right. It's like part biology, part psychology.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You can even be like in computer science and that, and you're a neuroscientist because you're like modeling these networks and stuff.
Right.
It's very interdisciplinary.
Cool. Well, if you would, why don't you tell us about your career? I mean, I know it, but just to sort of
Okay. You'll start
just describe your journey and what you studied along the way.
Yeah. So I got my bachelor's in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
So I was interested more in kind of like the cognitive behavioral side of things. I didn't have a very strong background in biology or genes or much of understanding. It was more about like, behavior, cognition, like theoretical memory, structures. Honestly, when I was in college, I was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do, what I liked.
I feel like
which is pretty interesting, But then I took it was like a pharmacology course, but it was also like brain pharmacology, and brain physiology and anatomy. And once I started learning about the neuron cell, like it just blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fact that you have these things that are acting like capacitors. There's like an electronic unit on a circuit board or something, and like their membranes are charged, and they have all of these ion channels that allow it to like pass current and then spike, and that they're connecting networks, and these spiking things is actually what's causing me to see things and hear things. It was just like
mm-hmm.
And yeah, after that I started to apply for graduate programs in neuroscience. It was tough because my background was in psychology,
Mm-hmm.
and so most of the like neuroscience programs I applied to wanted to see more like chemistry or physics or biology background. I know I was doing more things like development and social psychology and learning and memory systems, cognition. These are the kind of courses I was taking. But that's why UC Riverside was really cool, because like I said, I got my degree in psychology, but they had a dedicated department within psychology that was focused on neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like a side door into the hard neuroscience from a psychology background.
Mm-hmm.
And in my PhD there, I was studying learning and memory. And I was specifically studying the endocannabinoid system. And so that's like the endogenous chemical and receptors in your neurons. It's also actually in your gut, and they're all over the place. But
and for people who may not know, endogenous means that your body produces the cannabinoid versus like smoking a joint.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So cannabis, that's where cannabinoid comes from,
mm-hmm.
Or the word. Yeah. So it's naturally produced. It's like dopamine is naturally produced, but if take some cocaine or something, you're gonna spike it artificially.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not directly acting on the receptor. But anyways, yeah, so I studied how these endogenous cannabinoids and foreign substances, I work with mice, so we'd give mice these cannabinoid agonists, which is essentially a drug that increases the activity of some neurotransmitter system, and we'd monitor their behavior, and give them like learning and memory tasks, see what kinds of memory tasks they can perform and what they have deficits on. So I did some of the behavior stuff. But my main thing was electrophysiology. So taking tissue, brain tissue, and recording, like stimulating it and recording like the electrical activity afterwards. And yeah.
And when you say main thing, is that focus of research or skill or something in between?
It's more like a technical thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so you're a mathematician, right? So mathematician is pretty broad. You can have someone who's like specialized in probability, or someone who's like in number systems, or and that's what they do, and they know it really well. They can have a discussion about those other things, but if you actually go into the weeds, you know, you probably won't have that much to offer. So you can be a behavioral neuroscientist. So you're interested in quantifying literally the like movements, behavior, blinking, stimulus response, you know, memory, like responses, things like that. But electrophysiology is just the technique of recording electrical activity in human, or not human tissue, but living tissue.
And the idea that neurons are transmitting both electrical and chemical signals, and you're trying to measure that electrical signal.
The output is the electrical signal, but you can like apply a drug or something and see how those chemicals influence the electrical activity. And there's just, yeah, you could do all sorts of stuff, but it's definitely electrochemical communication. And yeah, it can be changed by a lot of things in the environment or just in the way that they're connected. So in terms of the cannabinoid stuff I was looking into, I was specifically looking at synaptic plasticity. So it's how these different kinds of neurons are connecting together and how their connections can change through the environment or experiences or through genes. So you do different kinds of manipulations. You see how the neurons are interacting electrically, chemically.
And by manipulations, you mean there are different variables that you're testing to see what happens with A, what happens with B. Like, what if we turn one thing on, another thing off?
Or, yeah, so just to be something maybe more straightforward is we'd give mice when they were like teenagers in their adolescent period during their biological development, we just hammer them with like huge doses of cannabinoids. And then we'd let them become adults and then see how their brains were different from a mouse who got a placebo during that same period. And we test their behavior and their learning and things like that. And then for synaptic plasticity, it's like, so one thing you could do, so if you can take a brain slice and if you stimulate like one neuron at a high frequency and you record from the secondary one, that high frequency one can actually increase the electrical coupling between the two. So if you just stimulate it once, you get like a test pulse and you get like a certain amount of depolarization, right? You keep testing it, you get a pretty consistent response every single time. But then if you zap it with like a high frequency, it's called a tetanus. The next time you do a test pulse and see how they're connected, you'll get a much larger amplitude. So their strength of their synaptic electrical chemical communication has increased. So what you can do is you can, you know, have these mice have one group that's gotten heavy doses of like cannabinoids during adolescence, another one that's got a placebo, and then test, all right, do these mice, do those increases or decreases in the synaptic plasticity, is that modulation altered? And yeah, so I was studying those kinds of changes.
Okay, and so this was during your PhD. Okay. And then you went into a postdoc, right?
Yeah, postdoc. And still neuroscience. So all of that stuff I was doing, behavior and the electrophysiology I was doing, that was all in slices. So we'd take the brain, we'd slice it, and we put it in like
literal slices,
literally like a slice of bread. Yeah. And then you put it in like a artificial cerebral spinal fluid, and you have to heat it up to temperature so it's like a body, and like keep it in a cozy space because they're slices, but the cells still survive, not all of them, but you know, enough to get recordings. So that was the PhD. And then the postdoc, I was still doing electrophysiology, but then I moved into in vivo, meaning that it's in the living animal. So you're not like taking out a tissue sample and testing with it. You're actually maintaining all of the different connections.
I'm sorry, I'm smiling because I have this image of like a mouse with like a diode in its skull.
Yeah, that's that's what's going on with in vivo. And there's different setups, you know, so there's like freely moving. So you put some kind of implant into their head and you cement it down, and they could have a wire connected and they can be walking around, or you could do something called head fixed. And they do this with humans. So when humans have like brain surgery too, and they fix the head and the skull with like metal, and you physically can't move it at all.
Yeah.
And that's so you can be very precise in where you're like recording from. And the mice can be awake and they can still behave. You know, you show them pictures or light, or what I was doing in my postdoc was playing sounds and seeing how their sounds were eliciting responses into their cortex. And that was in the context of Fragile X syndrome, which is like a pretty severe form of autism.
And when you do research, is a lot of it, well, one thing mathematicians get is, how are we going to use this? Right, went from students to, you know, all the way up. How are we going to use this?
Yeah.
And a lot of times the answer is we don't know, but this math is interesting, so we're going to study it. Other times it's very practical.
Yeah.
For example, in physics or, you know, electronics, you use math pragmatically. So one question is, how much of your research is theoretical or for the sake of exploration and learning, and how much of it is dedicated towards accomplishing something? For example, maybe you're investigating drugs because you want to help a pharmaceutical company produce better products. Or, you know, maybe you're studying hearing because you want to produce hearing aids for people.
Right. Well, I'll get a little bit into the weeds because it's not a simple, straightforward answer. Most of the research and how it's selected is done through grant funding. And
depending on where you work, right? I mean, if you're at a public university versus private versus industry.
That I'm not, I mean, industry, they want to make drugs and things to sell. That's their goal. But if you're getting grant funding, what gets funded is things that have translational relevance, meaning is whatever science you're doing, will this result in some kind of application that's meaningful to public health?
Okay.
And so if you have a story or a grant that's like that, you're much more like, there's more opportunities for those kinds of funding sources. If you just like, I want to know how this neuron works. There are certain places that do that, like the National Science Foundation. They'll fund just like basic biology, like fundamental neuroscience, but it's a very limited pool and you don't have a lot of access. But then you have like the National Institutes of Health and all their subdivisions like mental health and, you know, Department of Defense, and that's where most of the money is. And that's all, you know, come up with a disease or some kind of application to your research. So the interesting thing in my postdoc, you know, my PI, which is the primary investigator, my boss essentially, he was interested in bats and echolocation and how the brain is able to, you know, make sense of the sounds that are coming in and sound localization. So if you hear something, how do I know it's coming from up here? And the brain does a calculation comparing the two ears and all sorts of crazy cool stuff. Anyways, that's like what he really likes to do. But it's really hard to find funding for that kind of stuff, and very few people do it. So he would team up with people in like the biomedical research, and that's how we got into this like Fragile X thing. It was still sound, like we're still studying sound processing because these autistic individuals are very sensitive to these sensory stimuli. So it was a way he could still like have his love of auditory neuroscience, but also have it in an applied way and with a much more widely available pool of funding. So I know that was kind of roundabout way.
Well, it's interesting, yeah, because it sounds like there's a, you know, standard get a grant by appealing to certain needs. And then there's more of a kind of ad hoc, I'm going to piece together a project and make it work. So it sounds like there's a little bit of creativity in how you get your funding.
Totally. And there's strategies too. Like, and when you're like developing research ideas and projects, you kind of want to have one that's like, okay, this is probably going to work. And the funding is there and it's like the low-hanging fruit. Like we will be productive, we'll have something. And then you kind of have your more risky side projects that might not be as relevant. And those are the cool
but
ones.
Might pay off big and you never know.
Yeah, you gotta try it. but you also want to you don't want to like put all your eggs in one basket and go
Mhm.
crazy on some idea that, you know, a lot of times science doesn't work.
Right.
For it could be a lot of different reasons, but one, it's hard, and two, we don't know. That's why we're testing these things.
Right.
So
Right.
it's like there's a built-in failure, and in order to get published and get money, you have to not have failures all the time.
I think Einstein said, we don't know what we're doing. That's why it's called research.
Yeah,
We don't know what we're
right.
looking for. That's why it's called research.
Yeah, exactly. So, anyways,
Okay, so you had your PhD was on the cannabinoid system, and then you moved into hearing in your postdoc,
mhm,
and then you went on to another postdoc, bringing you up to date now with the
right. Yeah. So the current position I'm in at is UCSD. Our lab was at Scripps down in San Diego, but still in the same lab. We just kind of moved locations. And again, electrophysiology. You know, so that's when people like ask me what I do specifically in neuroscience. I tell them I'm an electrophysiologist. But in this one, we were studying interoception, which is the sense of your body and like what's happening inside. So like if you have like butterflies in your stomach, or you're hungry, or you have a pain, or what, that's all like body sense. But we were specifically interested in the heart. So how our brain interprets information coming from the heart. So the heart's not only just pumping blood, but it's informing your brain about what's going on, like, you know, like fight or flight response. Like if you see a snake, you know, your heart starts to pump, or it's like a feedback loop. So there needs to be communication both ways. So we were looking at sensory systems from the heart, kind of thinking about, you know, the classic thing is you have vision, right? So there's retina, and there's cells in your retina that can take photons in and activate, and that sends information to your brain. Well, your body's doing that too. There's like sensory neurons all over your body, internal organs, and the heart has that as well. So we found this pathway that connects the heart to the brainstem, that when it becomes highly activated, it will cause mice, and we haven't tested it in humans, but there's clinical evidence, they faint. It's a fairly common
syncope, right?
Syncope. Yeah. And a lot of people have it, and it's through the vagus nerve. So one of the most common forms of syncope is this vasovagal. That's what it's called, vasovagal syncope. So we found like the specific subpopulation of neurons that
vasovagal, you're the one.
That's what we should have done.
You make fainting lots of fun.
Sorry. We should have had a jingle along with our paper, right? It's like a link.
Vasovagal, you're the only nerve for
musical
me.
Abstract. It should be a thing. Yeah. But so, and yeah, that's what I'm doing now too. So now I'm involved in a project that's looking at myocardial infarction, which is a fancy science term for a heart attack.
Right.
And so when you have a heart attack, there's all sorts of information that goes to your brain, and there's like inflammatory processes that when you have a heart attack, there's signals that get sent to the brain, and it can cause inflammation in certain parts of the brain. It's pretty wild. So
that is wild.
Yeah. And again, there's this whole loop. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. Very interesting. And how the body can influence the mind, and the mind can influence the body.
Yeah, exactly. I'm actually involved in writing a review with my PI. And that's basically what we want to emphasize in this review, is that there's a two-way street going on here between the body and the brain, and it's very important. And most science are kind of divided into their subdiscipline, and they just kind of live in that little room. Like you have neuroscientists, and they're just like all about the brain. And then you have a cardiologist, and it's like, oh, atrial, you know, they can do so many things with the heart. Like I didn't know much about the heart before I started. It's so complicated, and there's so many different measures and tools. It kind of blew my mind. And there's no real like dialogue that's happening between these two groups of experts. So anyways, the review is going to be, well, we're talking about it, but the review is going to be like how that's important. And it's really important to understand different disciplines and to interact and think of it as a whole holistic organism rather than I studied the spleen or then that's it, because it just doesn't work that way.
Well, and symbolically, it would mean that like the heart is communicating with the mind, the body. So why not have the experts of the heart communicate with the experts of the mind?
Yeah. And it's actually pretty interesting that even the language and across cultures, right? They talk about the heart and the emotion, and that gets into this interoceptive thing. And there's interesting stuff going on there for sure. So, anyways, that's my background. It's a long background.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's cool stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't been keeping track of time. It's my job. Sorry.
Until we're bored, I guess.
Well, so first of all, if you were to talk to an undergraduate or a younger person who is really fascinated by science, what would you tell them about pursuing a PhD? What should they do? What should they not do? What advice would you give them?
Okay. So they've just got their bachelor's degree?
Yeah, let's say they're finishing up their bachelor's, they're thinking about applying to grad school.
Yeah.
And they're not quite sure.
Right. I guess the first thing I would tell them was because I had a different idea of what grad school was. I thought it was college 2.0, like you take classes, you get assignments, you read books, you get a grade. And that is not graduate school. That's like a side thing. Like you have to take classes, but most of these programs, they're just like be in the lab, doing experiments, doing research, quantifying. It's more like you're in a job and you have to be in the lab doing work. And basically all these classes, it's just kind of like, okay, yeah, go and show up and check the box. But those classes aren't very, very useful. What's useful is getting in there and doing the work. So that was a kind of a shock. So I would advise someone, if you want to get your hands dirty and do that, that's what grad school is.
Okay. Yeah. And well, two things. So it sounds like they give you these courses, so you're like a general expert, like, right? I'm sure you have a degree in psychology, so you had to take psychology classes and like neuroscience classes, so you know how to communicate broadly with experts. Yeah. And then in the lab, you dial into a very specific experiment and a very specific skill set. Yeah.
And you just, so what basically a PhD is, I know how research works. Like I know how to start from point A and see a publication.
Right.
And it's a very long, complicated process. If you're in a good lab with a good PI, they'll also train you or give you some information about the whole funding structure and the research structure, but that's not always available.
Right.
For you. It depends on the lab and how communicative the PI is. But in a postdoc, that's kind of, the postdoc is preparing you, well, traditionally it's preparing you for a professorship of some kind or faculty position where you have to be writing grants and doing these things. So it's like,
and publishing to get tenure.
Yeah. But so in a postdoc, you're supposed to be learning more about like the nitty gritty of, all right, well, next step is I'm going to be running a lab. So how do I do that? What are the considerations?
Like promotion.
Yeah. Yeah. But as a graduate student, I would definitely try to learn about those things more. I mean, there's a lot on your plate as grad student too, just adjusting to like the work demands. Like the hours are crazy and you go home and your work follows you home. It's not like a 9 to 5.
It's a different world.
Yeah.
And so the second point I wanted to make is I experienced something very similar with mathematics. And I think a lot of mathematicians go through this, where you're taking algebra classes and then you're taking calculus classes and you're solving problems. And then you get to a point where they say, okay, we want you to write proofs. Like, what? What's a proof? Yeah. It's like, well, that's actually what math is all about. And that's all you're doing when you get into a graduate program.
So I'm curious then. So what was how I described like the neuroscience, like the biology side, how was that with math in your graduate program? Like, does that feel similar? in my
Kind
description?
of, it's research in the sense that you're discovering something new, and it's so technically the word is epistemology, like how do you know something's true or how do you prove something or provide evidence?
Mhm.
And each discipline has its own epistemology.
Mhm.
And for math, that technique is proof.
Mhm.
And there's a whole structure, like what's a legitimate proof, what's not a legitimate proof. And you have a theorem, which is an idea or a statement, and then the proof demonstrates that the theorem is true.
Yeah. But how do you, I'm just curious, so like research, like I can go in there and I have variables like independent, dependent, yeah, there's a structure. But in math, like you just go up on a chalkboard and you start writing numbers. Like, how do you do research? It's
something like that. Well, it's a you find a pattern. Let's say you find a mathematical pattern, and then you say, okay, let's play around with the numbers and see what happens. So maybe you have a theory about primes. So you get your like, let's multiply some primes and see what happens. Let's multiply more primes, see what happens. So okay, there's a pattern here, and then say, okay, does this pattern happen all the time? And then seems like it is, okay. And then you have to come up with a proof showing that it happens all the time. So an example might be the Pythagorean theorem. So you have a triangle, 3, 4, 5. Hey, that works. And then you have like another right triangle. Hey, that works. So then you come up with a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Does that always work for all right triangles? Well, there's an infinite number. It's practically impossible to test every single one. So you have to come up with a methodology to abstractly show that this is true for all triangles. And that process is a proof. And that's true all that's mathematics.
So when you're playing with numbers initially and trying to find a pattern, to me, it's almost like you're running an experiment.
Exactly. You are. Yeah. And but they're different layers. So you're just playing around with numbers to see what happens. And I like to call mathematicians number scientists. They're investigating how numbers operate. And so you see, okay, is there a pattern here? Yes. And then you want to know, is it true for all cases? One of the most famous, a lot of famous questions have to do with prime numbers. And people have tried to find a formula that predicts the prime numbers. So, and they might come up with an equation that predicts the nth prime number, and it turns out it works for the first 12 prime numbers, but it doesn't work for the 13th prime number. And you might, in theory, have another one that goes up to like the 40th prime number, but fails at the 41st prime number. So there's a temptation to do like 10 different tests on your scratch paper and say, hey, it worked 10 times, it must be true. You got to know 100% for all numbers if that's your claim. And you can't just use, so that I guess is the big difference between science. Like if you do 99 experiments and all of them prove your result, you're going to say, okay, this is very, very certain.
It's highly likely. But yeah, we're still learning things. Okay, well, okay, but then there's also like physicists, right? And maybe in order to make a catapult, I only need the prime up to the 100th one.
Pragmatically speaking,
and I don't care. And then this rule still helps me launch a ball into the air.
Or like pi. Like, do you really need 100 digits? No. 3.14 is fine. Like 90% of the time, maybe 95% of the time.
Yeah. So if you have a mathematical, it wouldn't be a proof, but some tool that gets you somewhere, it still can be useful. So that kind of math research, even if it doesn't come up with like a full abstracted proof, you can still like show that pattern works for a certain.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because for most of the history of mathematics, math has been very pragmatic. And if you study the history of mathematics, like geometry, geo means earth, metry means measure. It was initially used to measure plots of land. Well, you'd only really need this when you have an agricultural society. Like where do we put the fence between my farm and your farm? So then you have this pragmatic need for geometry. I'm sure there's some, archaic nerds who like geometry just for the sake of geometry, but pragmatically speaking, it came out of a need. There's a similar evolution of writing and as well. And so anyways, math was usually seen as a tool and a pragmatic thing. Pythagoras was a mystic, and so he had a spiritual appreciation for numbers that we've lost as a society. So anyways, Newton comes along, and he was primarily a physicist and a scientist. And he was fascinated by Galileo and the idea that we live in this heliocentric universe. And so his question was, okay, that's what we observe scientifically. Like, what makes that tick? And so he developed the theoretical side, which is the theory of gravity, but he also needed mathematics to describe the process. And so he invented calculus
as a tool for his investigating the heliocentric,
for his theory. Yeah.
Sounds like a slouch.
This guy, man, if you look into his life and what he did, it's incredible, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Like optics and anyhow. So he's a special case, but he's also symbolically important because he represents the transition from like the Middle Ages into the Enlightenment. Because before he got into this, he was actually an alchemist, and he would turning lead into gold as a sort of pseudo-chemistry. And he decided, I'm going to figure out this theory and I'm going to provide the math. From that point, the disciplines diverged, where they had math people just doing math for the sake of math, and you had physics people doing physics, and they used math as a tool. So it wasn't like they were pragmatically aligned.
Yeah.
And you could argue where that turning point happened, but to me, that's when it really happened, where you have mathematicians who are focusing specifically on math for math's sake and proving theorems because they're interesting, that other disciplines use as tools.
Right. I was also just thinking, though, like you mentioned, like Pythagoras being like a mystic and stuff. Wasn't there like a large period in history where most of these kind of mathematics or academic pursuits were done in like monasteries?
Yes.
And just for the sake of research. I don't know when that occurred. But I think even I think Newton was pretty religious too.
He was, yeah.
Yeah.
And so technically it's called scholasticism, the period, and that's where with the word scholarship, where there was a study in monasteries, especially during the Middle Ages, because the major civilization centers collapsed and knowledge books was all kept in religious centers mostly.
And people who could write were the scribes and these things.
But what's interesting, getting back to this topic, and then I'll pick your brain a little more if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
The Euler is one of the most famous mathematicians, and this guy is like the Mozart of math. He had his fingers in all sorts of different disciplines of math. He invented like graph theory, among other things. And I want to say more about Euler, but I'll stick to the topic. One of the developments in physics is this idea of string theory. And the goal was to fuse classic, Newtonian, Einsteinian, like macro astrophysics with the subatomic,
like the quantum effect.
Quantum, yeah. So it's like we have rules for gravity, and we have rules for quarks and protons. Like, how do those fit together? And what people did is they said, well, maybe we don't live in a 4-dimensional universe. Maybe we live in a 12-dimensional universe or an 11-dimensional universe.
Right.
And we need 11 dimensions to mesh these theories.
Right. That sounds just as crazy as like Einstein saying, well, time is relative and space is curved. It's like, what? That's like, this 11 dimension sounds just as preposterous.
It
when
does.
Einstein was talking about something that's now clearly happening.
Mhm. And so let's say you're a physicist coming up with this idea and you think, okay, let's assume that we have an 11-dimensional universe. What would the math even look like? It's like, it turns out Euler studied multi-dimensional geometry because he thought it was cool. It's like, what if we just, instead of studying 3 or 4 dimensions, let's just imagine we have n dimensions and see what happens with the theorems and equations, because I think that's cool.
That's so is it like some cocktail napkin with these equations at some bar?
No, he did proofs.
Okay,
But the point I'm trying to make is he did it because he was fascinated by the mathematics. It had absolutely no pragmatic value at the time.
Right.
And so the arguments a lot of mathematicians make is, we are researching this because we find it interesting, and who knows when and how it'll be useful in the future.
Yeah.
There might be some application where it's needed. You don't know what's going to happen. And so the idea is mathematicians have a little easier time selling grants. Not necessarily. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about grants, but I do know, if your tools are, a chalkboard versus a particle accelerator, you're going to have an easier time convincing people to hire you. Like, you're not asking for a whole lot. And in terms of investment, right? You talked about, doing projects that may or may not pay off. I think a lot of that happens in mathematics. Like, when are we going to use this? I don't know, but we're also not asking for a whole lot in terms of funding.
Yeah. So, just out of curiosity, can you still do math like with pen and paper, or is it almost like required that you need like computers?
It depends on what you're studying. And it was a really interesting turning point in the history of math where it became controversial, where a proof was done by a computer, and a lot of people thought, is that a legitimate proof?
Yeah.
And and then what's interesting, the point of a proof is to show or demonstrate that a theorem is true. And you as a human, you check the proof to see that the proof is true, has no errors. Well, if you do a proof by computer, you're actually not checking the proof. What you're checking is the programming doesn't have any errors. So then if the programming is legit, you can assume that the proof that it's doing is legit. So it's like this meta proof.
Yeah. Or I guess maybe computers can be used as kind of like a experimental tool to run simulations and stuff. Like, we have some math idea, just see what happens when you run it through 1 million times in the computer. Anyways, yeah, I guess the reason I asked is, this is the economics of it. It sounds like there's a pretty low bar to entry in terms of running a math lab, right?
Well, I mean, there's
the skill and the expertise, but
the intellectual, I don't know what you call it, labor, creativity. Yeah, that's definitely challenging for sure. And you've experienced this before. Like, sometimes you'll run into something and you want the science and you want to have something happen, but you don't know the math. Well, what you do, you might consult a mathematician, say, how's this math work? And they tell you. And that's cool, right? We're specialized in society like that.
Yeah, I just thought the cost. So I think the economics was fascinating. So it's like these mathematicians almost have a little more leeway in what they're studying, because you don't have to buy like a $500,000 microscope or something,
right?
It's just it's their brain, and it's like, well, just go crazy and maybe you'll find something that will be used to make a string theory in the next 200 years.
Who knows?
Yeah.
And some of it is really esoteric. And like, if someone is describing their math work and you're an administrator, like, you probably can't tell the difference between, something that might have real life applications versus something that's purely theoretical. And and it's not to say that there's hierarchies of complexity, although there certainly can be. It's a different world. And Yeah.
Yeah, I do like what you also mentioned about like the collaboration, and you have specialties. And I was just talking about like with my current thing, or like there's like cardiologists and there's neuroscientists. Even
Right.
within that,
Right.
you got to bridge it, and with mathematicians and scientists, like yeah, it's all important all around.
And well, what's the next step for you if you're comfortable brainstorming,
Yeah,
theorizing?
yeah. So I want to go into industry, more applied stuff. So I've been looking around. It's a whole different world than academia.
Yeah.
But there's lots of options out there, and I'm actually trying to think about what I can bring to the table, and yeah, so still learning about that. But I'd love to do electrophysiology.
Well, I think you mentioned maybe Neuralink, like that's essentially electrophysiology.
Oh yeah, 100%. They're looking for more engineer type people
Okay.
and coders. It's more the software side that's, I think, the most difficult part right now. The electrophysiology thing. See, what's really popular right now is this AI stuff. So you can just record like a ridiculous amount of like neural spiking data. The hard part is, okay, now we have all this data. What the hell do we do with this? And that's how these AI models are able to manage that data and make sense of it. And that's the other thing too, like in this Neuralink and these other kinds of like machine brain interfaces. It's not about learning how the brain works. It's, can we decode all of this crazy information to make it work? And there's a black box in between how it works and it's
like output.
And when you're in industry, it's like, just give me the product. Does it work? How does it work? I don't care.
Right.
So anyways, I don't have a huge strong background in that kind of high level coding. So
are you interested in pharmaceutical companies at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Drug development. I've been on like drug discovery projects, and I see the whole process, the research process at least, still learning about like the economics and business side of things. But that's it. It's actually pretty cool how a lot of these drugs are tested from just like the basic chemical structure, and can your target be engaged with this molecule, and in a very like manipulated lab environment, all the way up to like animal studies to clinical trials, and just watching that whole pathway of a drug's development. It's pretty fascinating. Yeah. But I guess to answer your question, I'm looking for applied applications to my research and how I can make things to help people and society.
What do they say? Be of service and create value.
Yeah. Still fascinated just by how it works too. But that's where I'm at.
I like that fascination thing for two reasons. I know, like Peterson calls it the divinity of interest. Like if something grips your attention, it's like that's your calling. And Einstein said something similar about fascination and wonder. Carl Sagan too, this idea that if you can view science or the world with fascination and wonder, that can really grip you and be meaningful for you. So I'm glad
it's true.
I'm glad you have that experience, and I'm glad that
honestly, going through like graduate school and postdocs, you kind of get a lot of that beaten out of you a little bit, because it's all about like everything is so formalized and structured, and all of this like mystery is kind of underplayed. But it never goes away if that's your personality. Yeah. I mean, that's why I got into science in the first place, was just like the holy shit factor.
This is so cool.
Right.
I think that was my experience with maths. Like, wow, you can do that. That's so cool.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I feel like the evolution of a science career, in that middle section, it's all just like hammering out these practical things and doing all the whatever. But at the beginning, it's like this fascination of whoa, and then once you get like tenure and like in a senior position, then you can start doing some crazy stuff again. But it's like that middle thing, like that's your work life, and that creativity side is not quite as emphasized as much. No.
All right. Well, thank you for coming over today. It's been a good talk.
Yeah, very interesting.
And look forward to seeing you next time.
All right, thank you.
And thank you all for listening.
Yes.